today, along with Micah Salkind, Madi Rose, and Marie Cherry, who's behind you, and Louisa, who had to take off. Just a few words about Artists in Context, which are also covered in more detail on the sheet at the door if you didn't get one. Artists in Context was founded in 2009 to instigate, support, and highlight contemporary art practices that cross disciplines and fields, to invent new platforms, systems, and representations that change dialogue, thought, and behavior. And we're going to enact that today here in this conversation. The projects that AIC supports are traditionally projects that don't happen in a studio setting, but happen more in context. We've written that they live at the intersection of art and other fields, so there's a lot of cross-disciplinary work that Artists in Context is interested in. We've done a series of events representing Artists in Context over the last, I think, 7 months here in Providence, including an event with RISD called the Make It Better Conference for Design and Health, the Urban Pond Procession, which Holly Ewald spoke about at our last session, the Who Made Us Creative Fishbowl at New Urban Arts, One Book Club that we ran at Libertalia, a Women in Science and Animation Salon, and an event with Ellen Driscoll, who also spoke earlier this morning about her piece, Distant Mirrors. And if you want to know more about any of those projects, just ask Micah or myself or Marie. One of the goals of this convening, which this event is part of, is to further develop the next content that will be presented by Artists in Context. And we just hope to have a really rich conversation that can give us some direction to that end. So thanks again to The Spot for hosting us, and to Betsey Biggs, who taught this awesome course with her students here. And we're going to hear about their projects, and they'll take any questions you have. And just make sure to speak loudly. There's some noise. It's a thing that can't be turned off.
Great. Well, first of all, just a round to Jory and Micah and Madi and everyone who helped get this. Obviously, to Artists in Context. I was really excited when Micah asked me if I wanted to collaborate with them to be part of this project, because I think it's really important. And one of the things I was most excited about was having a chance to take my class from Brown into the city of Providence to have some dialogue and to get a sense more of the city itself and to kind of come off the hill. And it's been really fun. We meet actually every Thursday at Olga's and wander around the Jewelry District and throw around ideas for different kinds of projects, public art projects. So I was really happy with the projects that came out of what we've been working on today. It's really been great for me as well, getting to know the Jewelry District, getting to know the history, playing with it. Obviously some of the projects played with it more than others. And I guess, I'll start off. I wanted to ask all the students here if there was something that they had particularly learned through if doing the projects for an audience, a public audience today, changed the way you thought about your projects. And then I would love to hear questions that you all had, either about specific projects or about the class as a whole. Yeah.
I kind of felt like my project in particular changed a lot because I was kind of playing with this idea of kind of obliviousness or ignorance of the Jewelry District's history, and that a lot of us kind of aren't really well versed or even like curious about the area, and like presenting my project to our class. It was a different situation because like we're all kind of invested in this idea of learning about the area, and obviously everyone here is to some degree as well. But the project kind of changed a lot when there was this like blank slate, when we didn't really have I had no kind of relationship with any of the people who I was giving my tour to, and it was and I got kind of like a whole lot of different reactions depending on like the delivery of the tour and like people's levels of skepticism or like people's I guess willingness to like suspend their disbelief.
Could you say just like a few sentences about what the project was?
Sure.
We didn't get that.
Yeah. So my project was called Stories of the Jewelry District, a walking tour of Chestnut Street, and I wanted it to kind of maybe be perceived as like a somewhat historical tour, but I deliberately didn't call it like a historical tour because it was almost entirely fiction. The first building, I talked about several buildings on Chestnut Street. The first building I talked about was, I used like historically true information, and then the rest was just stories that I made up that were pretty ridiculous, but sometimes believed. That's a little background about the project and the way it was perceived.
Anyone else? I was just asking about, was there anything that you learned from doing pieces publicly today?
I can speak to mine. I was the photo jury, and so I captured images when I was walking around the jewelry district with my camera, and then I printed them out as if it would be a walking tour with the images. And so I was creating this in my own head, in my own personal space of the jewelry district, and I wasn't thinking that, or I was thinking, but it didn't really come upon me that I would be gifting my walking tour while other people were going and doing other projects. And so how our class kind of turned into a collaborative by chance, and how people were happening upon these different projects in like it wasn't like you were solely doing one project, you were exposing yourself to all of them, and how Jenny and Josephine's work kind of meshed into Emily's. They were over by the industrial building, so you aesthetically see these door frames, and then you are immediately jumped into a performance piece. And so how idiosyncratically our works kind of melded together, all under the umbrella of the jewelry district, was really wonderful.
Are there any questions? People have questions about the project as a whole, or any particular projects?
Well, did you select the jewelry district because it's now emerging as its own district visibly, and because I understand because it was less known by your students, but it does have a history, and that history continued beyond its original use, and it's a very desirable part of the city, and a part of the city that's been being paid attention to now. So I wonder how much your students understand that Providence is, in a sense, now being extended into this area more prominently than heretofore, and what they make of that.
Talk about that a little bit.
I think this class is very much structured around beginning sort of in learning about the area. We did readings and research both by physically involving ourselves just by walking around in the jewelry district, and for some of us by talking to people that we met, and then internet research, and I think several of us actually used Historical Society as a resource. And I think that, and we also sort of did some readings about sort of economic changes that are happening in the district, and looked at like what Brown is doing in terms of medical schools, and I think that did really impact a lot of our choices in the content of the pieces that we made. I think for Jenny and I, that was a big part of the relevance of using found materials and in relocating them, and having that sort of relocation and that sort of taking something and moving it into a different context and kind of having it be in flux, and using a door, and sort of that idea of something sliding and changing as sort of a way to speak to an area that actually has been through a lot of alterations. So I think it was definitely part of a lot of our thinking.
I just wanted to speak to our choice as curators of putting, this conversation in play with you, Betsy, and your students. Is that we have had conversations with folks about anxiety about this name change of the jewelry district and about losing history and about what it means to do projects in a place where you're either responding very cleanly and clearly to a tangible history, or you're doing something poetic that maybe doesn't necessarily correspond to that explicit history. I think one of the things that these projects all do in different ways is kind of like ask us to question, how much history do we bring into a art piece, and what's the value of that? And I think, Nick, your piece does that in really interesting ways, because as you said, like you grabbed people with a story about a building that was, something factually accurate, and then you departed completely from that. So that was sort of our thinking when we decided that the jewelry district was an interesting place to explore.
I think maybe also it's important for you guys to know that like in the months before we all put together these projects, each week we were kind of submitting proposals to Betsy on possible projects that we might want to do for this sort of an event. And given that like we began our conversations in class largely like around the actual history of the district, and the tension between like you said, the name change to the knowledge district, or potential name change. It was interesting to see like the progression of the way our ideas for projects develop. I know like for me in particular, like the first couple of weeks of proposals, I was coming up with these like kind of overt, almost like very political sort of like messages that were almost like less art pieces and more like activist pieces. Which maybe drawing that line is a bad thing to do, but as I think we all kind of had like these personal like kind of changes in how we wanted to deal with that issue, like whether we wanted to like really attack it or kind of approach it more subtly. And I think we all did do that in different ways.
Is there content that you found that you were surprised by in your research about this neighborhood? Like, how were your initial impressions of the neighborhood affected by what you learned in creating the project?
Someone else want to answer that? You all did historical. So I should say quickly, sort of as a afterword to what Nick just said, the way that I've structured the class, and particularly this first half of the class, which is ending, was that each week we looked at a certain lens through which you could approach public art. So we talked about history and narrative, we talked about intervention, we talked about participatory practice, we looked a lot at psychogeography and walking and sort of the history of that kind of thinking. So each week on Thursdays we met at Olga's at 10:30, and then we would walk around and three people would sort of pitch their proposal, which didn't have to be done because you can't do that every week for homework. And so history was one of the first ones, but then it kind of went out. But as Nick said, I think it may have informed people's undercurrents, even when the pieces weren't overtly historical. So, but what do you all think? I'm just curious about that question that Jory asked us.
I have a little bit different perspective, being I think the only Native person in the class. So my understanding of the history of the space spans pretty much my whole life versus a couple months or a couple years for the remainder of the class here. And so for me, it's been really interesting to see how my understanding of that has happened. And I did my project thinking about memory, and I was really interested in how memory transforms over time, how our memories of a place are going to change, especially if this concept of the knowledge district as a term goes through. I mean, you can already see the spaces changing, but how will people's understanding of that space change? Will people still say, where the old jewelry district building used to be, which is a very common thing in Rhode Island. Everyone uses where something used to be to describe how to get somewhere. For me, thinking about history, it was interesting because I had a much larger time span to work with. And I was really interested in thinking about what are people's understanding of memories and collecting those, and in the future, will someone else see, like, when we go back and look at this, like, will we still remember it in the same way?
Are there other urban spaces undergoing similar transitions that your class looked at? I'm thinking of the Bowery, New York, or Meatpacking District. I wonder if there are other cities that are going through this transition that inspire me to new thinking.
We haven't been looking specifically at anything. That's a good question. We have looked at, actually, we've looked at a lot at some of the creative time projects. And a lot of projects based in New York. I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there. And there was the Living as Form show that's been going on there recently. But we haven't talked specifically about other kinds of neighborhoods. We've been focused more on other kinds of projects that have been done in general and on the history of this particular environment. When we have looked at it, it's been a little happenstance. Emily, do you want to come here? I think people might have questions about your project. We have room for you. There's plenty of room for you. Oh, Rainey, yeah.
So I'd be interested if there were ideas that you kind of left on the cutting room floor that maybe if you had more time or, you're within the confines of the class, so it makes it sort of, it puts a lot of practical limitations on you. So were there things that you would like to do that you haven't had a chance to do?
I'd just like to speak to that. So,
Yeah,
so my
everyone should
piece
raise their
started
hand.
out as a digital art piece involving a Connect and motion sensing. So my piece was, it's at Patient Frontage Streets. It's on a parking space, and it's basically chalk markings of jewelry on the parking space. And when the original idea was to have like projections of jewelry on it, and when people got out of the car, they would kick the jewelry and it would decay. I've never done analog art before, nor public art, so but in thinking about what I wanted to do for this event, I had to think about like how could I transform this to like a doable thing. How first of all, I have to like downsize from the entire parking lot to like a parking space. I have to like think about maybe like chalk. But I think it worked out well. Like how it worked out, like chalk kind of decays. Like it has a similar like physicality of decay. Yeah, it was really it was great to think in that way, like think in the way of like analog art for a while.
So yeah, one of my first ideas that I still think would be really fun to do if I could. I know you guys probably all saw the Dynamo House. It's a really big little power station that's like a shell now, and the space inside is really interesting if you happen to have ever been in it. But anyway, it's all closed off now, and I'm just very inspired by that building as a whole. So I did some research on that building specifically, and like found out what its history was a little bit, and then the plans for it. And it was, as of until 2009, planned to be the Heritage Harbor Museum, as well as some office space. But construction stopped with the economic decline. But they seem to have like started doing stuff again. So I did email. I emailed to like someone at Brown, who told me to get in contact with someone else about like the ownership of it and like getting permission. And so I did, but he just never got back to me. So I don't know if that email address doesn't exist anymore. But the idea I had was to do a dance performance piece inside of it, largely just because I think the idea of like being in that space is such a powerful thing. And I still I don't think I've given up on it yet. Like if I can get in contact with whoever owns it, I would still pursue it, I think. So I'm really glad that we had these opportunities to brainstorm these ideas and come up with like maybe slightly larger than not larger than life, but like really big ideas that we had to put down. I think it was it's good.
Also, kind of a little bit in line with what Claire was saying, I think a lot of us maybe stuck to some of our original ideas and redesigned them, like not just for practical purposes, but because one of the things that we were doing in class often was trying to think of the best medium to convey like whatever our idea was. So I know one of our early assignments in the class was out of Janet Cardiff's walk book, which is like a sound walk experience. And I was really inspired by that, and I originally intended to do my tour as like a personal or group listening tour with headphones and like little iPods that would be like recorded with like binaural headphones, and each week as we would workshop our projects, that was one of the main questions that we would ask each other was like, what specifically about your project requires that you use this medium to present it. And so I think that's just kind of another thing that a lot of us considered and then maybe kind of used to redesign our projects.
And Betsey told us every class to think big and don't limit yourself because the limitations will come. So you have all the money, you have all the resources in the world. And so I actually was drawn to the same building, and I love art with humor, especially public art. So with the name controversy between knowledge or jewelry, I wanted a conference sticker that says, "Hello, my name is," and have that be the size of the building, and plaster it on the building and have it say, "Hello, my name is blank district." And so it would just be like a blatant in your face, like, this is what's going on, let's talk about it. But also like visually appealing because a name sticker on a building is kind of funny, I think. But obviously, there's only so many 8x11 pieces of paper I could plaster on that building to make it work. Did anybody else? Because I also don't know, right? It's possible with some of your projects that you had like bigger plans, and then by the time the proposal came to me and I met with you all, like it had changed. Are there any others that were? I guess not. I have a question for you guys, which is that I wondered whether the kind of whether you felt that having a different proposal each week that you were sort of thinking of, whether you felt like the final project you ended up working on ever combined different aspects of things you were working on, or whether it was more that one particular way of doing things, like the participatory stuff you looked at, or the historical stuff you looked at, or like the Janet Cardiff, or if something like grabbed you and you were like, oh, I want to check something like that out, or whether it was more of a melded thing.
I would say that Jenny and I had a sort of more melded experience. My first proposal actually had to do with these doors, but then we ended up working together on a proposal after that, and in our brainstorming for the participatory one, and we had an idea about like a lot of other materials and a lot of elements that like sort of it was sort of
talk about the other materials.
Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
That's kind of great.
We had. I think we ended up deciding on we wanted 2 large, probably door-sized
slabs. Yeah,
slabs
one
of
chalk and one ice.
Yeah, and they were going to form together to make a very simple structure.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny because like partway through that process, we considered glass and moving glass.
And we had this idea for everyone who came to like dunk their hands in oil and have to carry like huge glass slabs around. And we thought that would be like really, I don't know, we were like, yeah, that'd be great. Like, that's a great idea. And then like that was our idea for a while. And then there was like another one that was like, I don't know what, like I don't even know. It was just like there was a crazy array of materials and all this stuff. But then we sort of ended up wanting to work together and ended up really doing a lot of trying to figure out like what's the center of this, like what's the point of this, what's like the essential thing that we want to get across. And I think it was a great process to kind of work from kind of a whole divergent array of things and then really to kind of pull from that like what we thought would be powerful and what we both valued. So it was fun.
And then we did end up kind of moving big glass slabs around because our piece kept changing. So
Where did you eventually get the doors from? You said they were found? Or
the pile of doors was the first thing that I actually like sort of centered on like when I think even in my derive, we started the class. I don't know what I'm talking about. We started the class with these derives, where we just sort of like walk aimlessly and like find out what we're attracted to. And I think that influenced a lot of our final projects. But the pile of doors was just this sort of like very evocative thing, in a parking lot, in that parking lot. Yeah. So we just like moved them. We slid them.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Dia and I.
Actually, can everyone preface by saying what their project was? Because maybe not everyone.
We created the pink posters with directives on how to like get closer to your environment, get like with using your senses to get more intimate with your environment and notice your surroundings and be more appreciative. But I think originally we were drawn to like more interventionist or aggressive ways of getting people's attention, but sort of had a revelation that that's not necessarily the most powerful way of connecting to people and inspiring them to make connections.
And I think that one thing this class kind of taught me is like how much we don't understand or really know anything about the knowledge district. And that's kind of what our project is about, because we can't really understand, but all we can do is like engage with it with our senses. And that's the point of the whole thing. It's kind of an opening up of the senses to really like create a relationship with your environment, which you have whether or not you want to admit it, and it was kind of enforcing that.
I wonder if some of you approached your project differently because you were uncomfortable with the idea of doing art. Did anybody like come into this being like, I just don't do art, this is weird? Or was everybody like totally comfortable with the idea of making public art?
I can speak to that.
Okay.
I did have that reaction, and I remember saying to Betsy that a challenge I have, or something that's been hard, is that I always feel that a public project, somebody should learn something from it, and I have to teach somebody something. And so I definitely approach things with that mentality, and I look at art sometimes and I think, I don't see this teaching anyone anything, there's no point to this, and so that it's a challenge that that's drew me to this class, I think, because I'm trying to see it in a different way. But I think for this project I definitely fell back on my idea of I'm more comfortable with having a learning objective be part of my project.
Can you describe your project?
Yeah, it was I am a investigator with the Industrial Paranormal investigators, and I was investigating the haunting of the Victory Finishings electroplating factory. And so it was me engaging with the ghost of Cyril Dodge, who was he founded the gold plating industry here in Providence in the late 1700s, and it's now come back to haunt the last building associated with his industry, which is the electroplating factory, which is about to be torn down.
Cool.
So.
Did you feel like it was didactic, or that you were able to be poetic, even though you approached it from a like educated standpoint?
Yeah, I think it was didactic. I'm a park ranger, and I fell into that I'm comfortable speaking to people in that way. So my beginning was definitely like that, because I feel people did need to have a context about what this was about. But I was able to be more creative and less didactic with the audio recording I did of Cyril Dodge, and so I tried to make that more playful rather than
introduce
here's
the term
information.
poetically didactic.
Poetically didactic, sure. So, yeah.
Cool.
This doesn't really address your question, but it's in the same vein of what Dia was saying. Just kind of coming with it with a sort of feeling of discomfort in that since I am not a native of Providence and didn't know anything about the Jewelry District, I felt uncomfortable, especially when we were doing the historical/narrative projects. Just I felt uncomfortable speaking for it in a small way, that it wasn't my place to be doing something with it, especially since I haven't formed a relationship with it yet myself. Which is why I think for my project, I responded to just a particular place in the Jewelry District, which was that, I don't know if you guys got a chance to see it, it's very obscure. The map does not indicate it very clearly, but it's that little narrow walkway between the bead store and Body Sense, the massage theater place. So I just really loved how beautiful and meditative and quiet, and how perfectly manicured it was, even though it's kind of this place that people would not look at or think to walk by or anything like that. So I responded to that, and my project basically had a suitcase in the middle of the walkway, and people were invited to come pick up a heart from the floor that I kind of scattered around. And the wind sure had a lot of fun with that. And write a thought, a fear, a secret, something they want to get off their chest, and just put it in the suitcase and then get one out. So I think I put a lot more focus on the person who participated and that person in that particular place.
And I should mention too that I wanted the history, responding to the narrative or history of the jewelry district, of the environment. I was pretty clear, I think, with everyone that was one way in which you can engage with place, but I really wanted to give people the freedom also to engage visually with place, to engage in terms of the sound of the place, which I don't think anyone totally did. These guys probably were the closest, because the first pink directive is to listen, which is really nice. But I wanted, this class is called Art/Place, and it's really about responding to place in all the different ways that you can. So that was part of it.
I think it's interesting that you all seem to have staked your claim through an interpretation that's very personal on this area. And at the same time, you should know that there's been a lot of political to-do about this place, and the commission that was formed to oversee its future has been a big political thing. So, for Providence, for everyone. So, it's nice that you kind of went underneath that and looked at it from your own personal points of view and learned how to claim it yourselves as kind of individual commissioners.
And we actually did start with that. Or the first week we did it, everyone did a derive and wandered, because I wanted people to have their own experience of it. And then we did a week where we did a lot of reading about the sort of contested nature of it now and the politics of it. And actually, it's funny what Nick said, because it was the second week, almost every project was like a really activist, like, what do you mean they're calling it the Knowledge District? And there were big projections involving, they're not actually, Christy and Jamie couldn't be here, but they had 20-foot tall projections on either side of the med school building, one saying like Knowledge District and one saying Jewelry District. So I think that most people here are pretty aware of the politics of it. My sense, and I don't want to speak to people, but my sense was that, similar to Judy, people started out getting very riled up and then sort of realized they didn't know that much about it and maybe felt a little uncomfortable taking it on. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's great.
So kind of circling around to Micah's question too, is I'm an aspiring public art administrator, but I also consider myself an artist, and I would love to be a public artist as well. And so for me it was really interesting working on this project, because I kept having like the little like angel on my shoulder or devil on my shoulder, whichever one you want to call it, being like, this can't happen, this shouldn't happen because of all the underlying politics. What makes you as an artist think you can come in and create your own dialogue? How are people going to engage in this dialogue? Is it just my one voice that no one cares about? And my whole thing is Jillian Christie's work I love, because she gets the entire community involved. And so Betsy and I talked a lot about this, where she said that just as a creative person, as a creator, I had to go towards my buzz, like find your light of fire and go towards it for wanting to create, and don't worry about because at some point you have to be true to yourself. And so this project for me was hard to be true to myself as a creator, but then also the public administrator side, knowing the circumstance and the context, being an artist in context. So
something that this points out to me now that I'm thinking about it is maybe that political conversation is a bit alienating. Maybe it's not actually as inclusive as it might be, and this is partly why the commission is such a controversial thing.
Yeah,
and
such a contentious thing.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that a lot of you responded in very personal ways to a space that you started out thinking about in terms of a more collective consciousness about politics. Like, I don't know, I think that's telling in terms of how can one actually engage in a space that's contested on a macro political level, but maybe isn't experienced on a micro level in that way at all.
Well, a big part of public art is conception of the audience. So we should use that word and say, audience is of your own design to a certain extent.
And as someone who I almost always am connecting my art to something that's political, I'm like always, that's sort of what I'm doing, whether it's in a very subtle way or in a very forward-thinking way. And my initial projects were also very much interested in this idea of being political. But I was also really worried in thinking about if I'm going to do something political, that's going to get a community riled up. And not being able to follow through on helping them through that movement was something that was really important for me not to do. So, because as a Native, I have the right, in theory, to say, this is my place, this is my fight. I can be on a side here and not have to worry about it. But at the same time, I also have other responsibilities that involve me making sure that I'm doing it in a safe way with the community, and I'm not bringing them into a space or a place that they are not ready to deal with, or I'm not ready to help them along all the way through. And so for me, stepping back from that political was actually a way for me to safeguard, I felt like, the community from what I might potentially be exposing them to. And also the time limit, in the sense that, this is probably the middle of October. I've only been doing this for about a month and a half. So I wasn't going to be able to do something of a political nature and have it actually carried through in the amount of time that we had. So there were other things that were working against me with in basis of time, and also thinking about how
What's your
I can make it.
responsibility?
Yeah, what is my responsibility? Because I feel like in a way I have a little bit more, because this is my home.
And actually, I have a question about that for the class, because that was something we talked about a little bit earlier in the class, was this idea of responsibility, which I think Dia actually initially brought up. Maybe I brought it up, but we were talking about if when you do a piece with a community, that we were looking at some works by Wendy Ewald and different things where people get involved with the community and it's a collaborative piece. What's the sense of responsibility that you have towards people, and how can you, is there a way you can limit that in terms of expectation also? So, are you starting a nonprofit, or are you doing a piece for one day or 1 hour and everything in between? And I don't know, did any of you think about that at all when you were doing your pieces? Or because I kind of hear that with AIDS, like you shied back from that kind of thing for that very reason.
I know with my piece that I think I too wanted to avoid kind of playing a role too large of a role of myself in some sort of ongoing discussion of it, but rather to I intended more to inspire a curiosity and stimulate a discussion that would exist beyond my initial projects. So rather than hold some open forum discussing the significance of the Jewelry District and how that plays into this ongoing tension, I kind of wanted to be able to make someone else want to start that, because I didn't feel like I could play a continuous role.
I was wondering if any of you, along the way in making proposals for your projects, if any of you went back further in time about the history of the land that we're on, or the space. Or was it really much more focused on more recent history and the controversy that's going on now, in this district?
Well, I specifically situated my piece on the site of the first jewelry factory, the Richardson and Hicks Orbone building, and I was trying to call attention to the absence of it through this scattered jewelry on the ground, like graffiti of jewelry on the ground. Yeah.
Are you talking about a more like geological time?
Or
Well, if you want to go back that far, sure. But, you know, I think in the history of Providence, was it something else before it was the jewelry district? I mean, what was here? I'm sure you could go back in geological time.
That name change was really contentious.
Yeah, I'm sorry?
That name change was really contentious.
Right.
I do think that probably most of us kind of, like in the same way that maybe like people are getting caught up in like the possible name change to the Knowledge District now, I think most of us focus like our attention on like the jewelry manufacturing period because we're learning about the jewelry district. I think like for a time like we also like had kind of an ongoing discussion about the changes that happened because of the construction and destruction of the freeway. And kind of we spent quite a bit of time on that as well. But yeah, it is kind of interesting that like we kind of chose to focus. We like made our focus based on the name and kind of ignoring a lot of the discussions that we're talking about with name now.
We also had we've only been in class for really a month and a week. And so for the past 2 weeks have been creating these works. And then the 3 weeks before that, we only had 1 week because you have to condense in a semester. We had a week for history and narrative. And that's just 1 week, and that's 1 week's readings. So, and I think actually there's really not that many, I'm probably speaking upon this ignorantly, but there weren't that many resources about the history of the district before the jewelry district, or even the sources. If you Google jewelry district, I know that was really frustrating for me. Google Maps can't even give you boundaries. It doesn't. Pardon?
Did James Hall speak with you at all from PPS?
No, I didn't speak to James Hall.
No. Yeah.
Would that be a good resource?
He would be.
Yeah, because the thing is, like, then we looked at interventions and participatory art. So it was essentially. This whole class was it's not a survey, but it's all the different ways to think about place, and history narrative was just one part of it. But it's part of that, it was first because it has to be that underlying vein that is coursed through the entire semester and throughout all of your projects. So you can't really do intervention without knowing the history or the background. But I think it's just pretty much what we've been gravitating to. And so Emily is our community historian, so that was like her piece is like the crux of it is history, whereas I think of myself more as a visualist, so mine is more I took photographs.
I didn't get to see all of this, but is any like the pieces that ground university's role in the change that is going on in the jewelry district / knowledge district?
I think we were all a little uncomfortable though because we're brown students, and then so to create artwork. Yeah, I think we've all acknowledged that it's a interesting line to play that we are part of the. We're coming into a community that our university is already coming into.
I mean, I would say that I don't think that any of us explicitly made that the central content of what we were doing. I do think that as brown students deciding to spend a lot of hours working here and talking to people here and like, how does this look? I mean, I think that says a lot of things just in itself. And it says, for one thing, that we are interested and that we care about this place, and that we would like to spend time here and try to get to know it. I mean, it could also say that we think we're worth looking at, or we think. I mean, it could have a pretentiousness to it, but I think there is sort of an implicit, like, we care about what's going on here. Maybe that doesn't read that way, but I think it does read that way.
Also, though, in our research of like, regarding the conflict of the jewelry district versus knowledge district, I think we probably kind of realized that though Brown, I mean, there's kind of like this. It's not that Brown's presence in the jewelry district is the only thing that is kind of like spearheading this movement to rename it and to rebrand it, but rather that like there's a reciprocal relationship between like the medical school and the biomedical industry, and like then there's like it's not. I mean, because I feel that I kind of had this conception of like Big Bad Brown as like the only presence that is.
I want to clarify. This is not a this was not a finger pointing question, but it's the like what is the history?
Yeah.
You are, by going to Brown University and dealing with this thing, you are actually part of that history, and I was just curious whether you looked at that.
Yeah, I think
you want to talk about gentrification. This was a really industrial place. Then 60s, 70s, a lot of artists worked here. Then it got kind of fancy condos, prices went up. Now Brown University is coming in, we're losing the tax base. So there's you're in that trajectory by going to that university. And I was just curious, and I don't mean to say like, you have to address that because you're a big bad institution, you know. So I didn't, you know, that was not the intent.
I think it's interesting too, the very first week of proposals, I would say, were almost uniformly addressing it in maybe not the most sophisticated manner, but in a very like impassioned manner. And there were, I mean, actually the most dramatic response came from two students who unfortunately are not here. They're freshmen and they're with their parents at dinner. It's parents' weekend. But they were just like, I got this like email, this impassioned email from one of them in the middle, having done the reading. He was like, on the Brown website, it just says the Knowledge District. I can't believe it, you know? So I think that some of it is that people felt a little bit implicated, but also thinking through what our role is, like what Josephine was talking about, I think was interesting. Just, you know, the different nuances that Brown students have, and the ways that they can influence the institution as well, which is important, I think, for you all to remember, right? And how I think that there's a way. I mean, if anything, I would say I've been. My advice to students has often been to pull back a little bit from being too didactic, but to try to, if they're interested in addressing the issues, which not everybody was, to try to invite people into the dialogue, as I think Dia was saying, rather than confronting it head on. But many of the early pieces were much more, I would say, confrontational.
The traditional jewelry district was actually only the jewelry district now is a recent name. The heart of the jewelry industry was always only this was more imperial knives, it was cutlery, it was steel, it was Davol rubber, it was Narragansett Electric, there was a Collier here. So that's also a neologism, the jewelry district. This was an invention, I think it was invented by the CNC administration.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, just the notion of marketing of marketing is something that public art has to be aware of too.
Placemaking.
Placemaking, exactly. Name.
I'm curious. I think we have to wrap up in a second. I'm seeing some emotions from Jory. I'm wondering if the students have any, like, one last question. If anyone has a question for the audience about your pieces, or. I kind of threw that at you. You weren't expecting it.
I'd be interested in thinking or asking what your experience was for interacting with Dia and Eve's piece, because I'm interested in thinking about. I really enjoyed the idea of like becoming intimate with the space by being physically close to it. And I was more interested in sort of the memory piece, but they're more interested in the physical aspect. And I don't know, what were your reactions to that?
Yeah, I love that. And I also liked how you taped over the directional sign for the 95. Like I was like, oh, well, people are gonna see this. I thought it was like hearing someone say it as like a poem. Also, like the way you spaced the text was well thought out. It was fully realized.
I actually saw that one walking back, so I wasn't aware of it as part of this. So it actually did make me stop and get close and read. So it really did what you meant for it to do. It was lovely. That out of any of them made me stop and just smile and go, thanks, you know? Because how often are you do we stop and we take a look at the little tiny places within our city? We're just walking over them, so it was great.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming out and seeing the work, and thank you all for